Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second seminar from the series on critical mental health, which is organized by the Rare Disease Social Research Center at the Institute of... Someone muted me. So this is organized by the Institute for Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences. But as you can see already, we are quite an international group here. And just few housekeeping rules. So as any of the seminars organized by our research center, we would first listen to the talk, and then we will have time for questions and discussion. And if you could please tell your affiliation before you ask a question, so then we can actually get to know each other and know where, or like if you're in maybe unaffiliated or independent scholar, that's also great, welcome. But just like let us know where you come from, so we can also just have this a bit of a regular seminar vibe here. Unfortunately, we can't go for any coffee later, but let's just hope for a vivid discussion. And now I will pass to Beata, who will introduce our guest.
Okay, thank you, Kasia. Sorry, I still have to admit people while talking. So yes, welcome everybody, and welcome Professor Junko Kitanaka. Thank you so much that you agreed to join us. I'm sure your schedule must be crazy busy, but so it's really an honor to have you here. And I'm sure many of you are acquainted with Professor Kitanaka's work, but I will just shortly introduce her. So Professor Kitanaka is works in medical anthropology in the Department of Human Sciences at Keio University in Tokyo, Japan. And her book, Depression in Japan, Psychiatric Cures for a Society in Distress, published in 2012 by Princeton University Press, has won 5 awards, including the American Anthropological Association's prize in 2013. And the book has been also translated into a few languages. Professor Kitanaka has published extensively in most important anthropological and medical journals, including The Lancet. She has also served in many journal editorial boards, including Biosocieties, Medical Anthropology Quarterly, and Cultural Anthropology. And apart from her academic achievements and career, she has also been present in the global media, including New York Times, New Yorker, BBC, CNN, and some other international channels, Danish, German, French, national TV channels. So also, maybe just a few sentences of comment, because this is a critical mental health seminar series, as Kasia mentioned, and we had previously Professor Bruce Cohen here. Both of his talks have been recorded, so if you guys are interested, I can also send you the links. And I think this meeting today is very interesting because unlike Professor Bruce Cohen, who is like, I would say, brutal critique of psychiatry, and who does not seem to see any like real critical potential of psychiatry itself, work of Professor Kitanaka, if I understand it correctly, shows that there is some transformative potential in psychiatry that can be considered social medicine, and I hope to hear more about it just now, and I pass the voice to Professor Kitanaka. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very kind introduction, Vita, and I really appreciate this wonderful opportunity to speak to all of you. Just to get a sense of who you are, I was wondering if you'll be able to raise your hands about like what you do, like what professions or what interests do you have? And just sort of broadly, just so that I get a sense of how much I should talk about, say, medicalization or something. I just want to get a sense of how many of you are clinicians, how many of you are social scientists, and how many of you are independent scholars, if you don't mind. So if you could raise your hands if you're clinicians. Okay, so quite a few. What about social scientists? Okay, and independent scholars. Okay, and any other categories that I'm missing? Must be a lot. Anyway, thank you. So okay, so some of what I'm going to talk about might be too familiar to you, but since I don't really know how many share the same concepts, I'm going to go over them anyway. And let me share screen. Let's see. One. Okay. And okay, so today's talk is titled Towards Global Social Medicine, a Medical Anthropological Approach to Depression. And I realized later that this might be a little misleading because I ended up not writing so much about global social medicine, but more about depression in Japan. But hopefully this will lead to a discussion about what can be global social medicine. So today's questions: what may be the social consequences of the global epidemic of depression? That's the main theme. And more specifically, I'm going to be talking about what may be the cause or the causes of the epidemic of depression first. And then I'll talk about how this simply led to the medicalization of everyday distress in Japan. And thirdly, what may be the medicalization's consequences? And I'll discuss care of the self and the new emerging forms of digital surveillance. A little bit about my background. My work has mainly been about depression. So as Vita kindly mentioned, my book, Depression in Japan, which was published in 2012, has been translated into Japanese, French, Persian, and Korean, and some of it has been translated into Chinese. And I think my dementia work is now being translated into Spanish. And I've done interviews with BBC, and I've written about sort of the overview of the anthropological approaches to depression with Stefan X in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Anthropology, for those of you who want to get a sense of the culture in depression. And more recently, I've done 2 articles for The Lancet, one of which is about depression, or rather the absence of depression in places like Myanmar. So we did a sort of a comparative piece with Stefan X and Harry Wu about the history of depression in the current state in Myanmar, China, and Japan. And as we discussed and as we found out, if you actually look at the epidemiology of depression, there's quite a bit of difference in the rates, the prevalence of depression across the globe. So, but then again, like I said, there has been an global epidemic of depression, especially since the 1990s. And what may be the causes? And those of you who are clinicians, those of you who have been following the medical anthropological literature would know the answers. But, well, these are the sort of the symptoms of depression. And one of the obvious causes that one might think about is economy. And especially if you look at Japan, there's definitely the economy that's as the cause of the depression, because the depression really began to become a national problem after the collapse of the bubble economy. And it's clearly linked to the rates of layoffs and bankruptcy and so on. So the historically high rates of suicide that began from 1998, which sort of gave a foundation for the rise of depression in Japan, was definitely an economic one. But that doesn't explain everything, because in some places where depression became like a huge problem, a societal problem, such as in the US, at the time, economy wasn't necessarily stagnated. In some places, the economy was booming, and yet antidepressant sales went really very high in a very short period of time. So the second reason one might think about is the spread of the scientific knowledge about depression. And this, to an extent, is definitely a cause of the global rise of depression, because there was a massive campaign to educate people about the psychiatric notion of depression in places where depression wasn't really talked about before. So when I started my field work in 1997, people really didn't know much about depression. I mean, they've heard the word, but they never really associated the word with themselves or their close ones. And even if somebody was suffering from depression, they tended to hide it because it was so heavily stigmatized. And this like radically changed in just a few years. When I started my main field work in 2000, everybody was talking about depression. So it was such a sudden change. And I'm kind of curious about, if that might be the case in each of the places that you reside as well. So definitely the new scientific concept of depression had a lot to do with the rise of depression, but that doesn't explain everything, because Japanese have had the scientific notion of depression for over a century, if not for centuries. If you actually look at the traditional notion and traditional medical practices, there are notions that are keen to depression. So that, doesn't cover everything. And of course, as you know, the rise of depression has a lot to do with DSM-3 that was published in 1980, which really enlarged the notion of depression. So previously, depression used to be defined as an indigenous form of psychiatric disease. So really pointed to a more severe forms of depression, which was called melancholia. But in 1980, when DSM-3 came about, it really combined the traditional notion of endogenous depression with neurosis. So the kind of suffering, the kind of distress that people might suffer from loss of somebody close to you, which would be included in the category of neurosis rather than, or just a normal sadness, was now suddenly included in the concept of major depression. So this sort of enlargement of the concept, the diffusion of concept by DSM had a lot to do with the rise of depression. But then this was published in 1980, and the rise of depression didn't happen globally, at least until the 1990s. So there's a sort of a time gap. And of course, the main reason, as all of you probably know, is the rise of Prozac and the sort of the change in the technology of the therapeutic technology for depression. So the new generation of antidepressants, such as Prozac, really became like a huge blockbuster. And it was hailed, especially in the United States, as a happy pill, a magic pill that can transform people's lives. So people who were going through psychotherapy for years and years, who weren't getting better, took Prozac, and suddenly found themselves feeling happy, creative, and productive. So, so this really changed the notion of psychiatric disease in general. It really was transformed from a label that the psychiatric experts would impose upon you, something that's so stigmatized and stigmatizing that you wouldn't want to be associated with, to something that suddenly people, like everybody, was craving for. They would self-diagnose by checking on the web, the self-diagnostic checklist, and decide that, oh, I'm depressed and I need antidepressants, and would begin to seek psychiatric care. So that, especially combined with the rise of internet, radically changed the way people began to talk about mental illness. And Prozac definitely had a lot to do with that. But if you look at the discourse in the United States and elsewhere, of course, from the very early time when Prozac began to be sold, there were critiques who were saying that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we are now approaching depression as a matter of new chemical imbalance. Because depression is really a sign of contradictions of life. It's really a sign that you're not living your life fully, that there are things that you have to look at, that you have to reflect upon yourself. So that could really lead to new insights about the way you live. So reducing depression to the matter of chemical imbalance misses the whole point, and also deprives people of opportunities to really change their lives, to really sort of reflect upon the meaning of your own life. And there was also critiques coming from social scientists who were saying that reducing depression to individual neurobiological disease does huge damage because it helps conceal its roots in social contradictions such as war, abuse, poverty, injustice, discrimination of all kinds. And it's also problematic because it kind of fosters an idea that you have to be happy to be able to live a full life. And if only happy people can be regarded as healthy, and if you're feeling down, if you're feeling sad, or if you're feeling sort of doubtful of your life, then what you do is that you take a pill, then that sort of denies an aspect that's so fundamental to human existence, that it's really distorting the way we live. So that sort of medicalization critique was there from the very beginning, even at the rise of Prozac. And of course, there are critics coming from elsewhere, especially in places where depression wasn't really talked about as a medical problem, wasn't really talked about as even a problem before, such as Japan, Sri Lanka, and Iran. And those other places where, for instance, in Japan, depression was talked about as part of normal human experience. And there were many idioms in which people talked about depression without necessarily pathologizing it. And there were other places such as Iran and Sri Lanka. Obia Sacred anthropologist writes about this, where people who would be diagnosed as suffering from severe depression might in fact be regarded as a religious person who sees that this world correctly, that it's full of suffering. So if you take a Buddhist lens to the phenomena, then people might not have to pathologize such a condition as depression. So there were critics who are coming out to say that this is actually a global imposition of medicalization. This is like a form of Western hegemonization, the Americanization of global mental health. So my question when I began to do fieldwork in Japan was this, that is this sort of creating, is Japanese being hegemonized? Are they buying to the same kind of neurobiological reductionism, the individual reductionism that actually impoverishes people's understanding of themselves and also serves to conceal social contradictions? So is it desocializing depression was the big question that I had at the beginning of my research. So the second part that I like to talk about is exactly this. Has this medicalization simply led to the medicalization of everyday distress in Japan? And my answer is that it didn't actually lead to that. It actually led to, helped create a very unique condition in which people began to really reflect upon the social roots of depression, if anything. So depression has never really talked about as just an individual neurobiological problem, but it's always been talked about as a biosocial disease that's deeply rooted in social structural injustices. In particular, depression has been talked about as an illness of stress and especially work stress. And this is a cartoon that became hugely famous. The title is something like, why don't you quit your company if you're driven, like if you're feeling like killing yourself? And this was retweeted like, I don't know how many times. And it became so popular because so it vividly depicts a point at, when one becomes so depressed that one just is tempted to kill herself, even though she doesn't really want to kill herself. So here, let me start reading. So my tone might change a little bit. So in a science fiction story written in the tradition of Brave New World, American novelist Gary Stuttgart depicted a near future American society in which everyone wears a small smartphone-like device around their neck and constantly scan themselves and each other for information about their genetic and social backgrounds, illness history, personality, current psychological states, and even social likability ranking among peers. The workplace setting features a big screen that constantly streams workers' moods, stress levels, and productivity, mapping out a network of feelings, generating a thorough psychological management system that will not allow the slightest disruption in workplace activities or discord in people's minds. A future something like this, of preventive, even preemptive psychiatry is what comes to my mind when I go through my annual health checkups at Keio University. Before I receive the usual list of physical exams, including chest X-ray, cardiac electrogram, blood test, and I'm also asked if I like to respond to a questionnaire about my psychological health. And now we are encouraged to submit this form online. This includes questions such as whether I sometimes feel worthless, or that life is entirely hopeless and not worth living, or whether I ever think about suicide. I'm also asked about my work and work environment, whether I feel like I'm working too hard, forced to accomplish a tremendous amount in limited time on tasks that require a level of knowledge and skills that are beyond me, or whether I feel that my work suits me and gives me a sense of autonomy, and that I'm in a department that has a congenial atmosphere. While it is very nice that my university cares enough to ask me about these things, this is simply part of the latest system of psychological management called stress checks, introduced nationwide in 2015 in order to screen workers for their psychological health. Once considered a taboo subject in Japan and in an employee's personal business, workers' psychological state is now part of Japanese corporate healthcare, smoothly incorporated into already existing health monitoring. And one of the questions that I'd like to ask you later is whether you have such a system or not. Such psychological screening may seem pertinent more than ever to many Japanese, as there are now over 1 million people diagnosed with depression in Japan, with more than half the workers reporting that they're stressed out. And the media continues to feature cases of what Japanese call overwork depression and overwork suicide. In 2015, there was a national debate about the overwork suicide of a 24-year-old woman, Matsuri Takahashi, who was an employee at Dentsu, which is Japan's most influential advertising and public relations company. Takahashi had graduated from Tokyo University and succeeded over fierce competition to get into this highly selective company, only to be driven to throw herself off a company dormitory balcony on Christmas Day. She had been working more than 100 hours of overtime per month, habitually staying in the office overnight and sleeping only 3 to 4 hours per day. She was exposed to what Japanese call power harassment by superiors who said things like, "Your overtime wastes company resources. Don't come to the office with messy hair and red eyes. You appear to lack self-management skills." when you look tired. Her self-mocking but increasingly desperate tweets, and she was really funny, included statements like, "It makes me laugh when I spend 20 hours per day in the office. I don't even understand what I'm living for. I've lost all feeling except that I want to sleep. I don't want to wake up. I just want to disappear." And 2 months before her suicide, this rather cynical note: "Cause of death, mentoring with love." This particular case of overwork suicide came as a shock to the nation, especially because there had been a similar case of suicide by a 24-year-old male worker at the same company in 1991. That case gave rise to an entire grassroots workers' movement against overwork depression and overwork suicide. When Japan's Supreme Court ruled in 2000 that this man's suicide was triggered by depression, which was caused by excessive overwork and stress, the government fundamentally revised labor laws in order to officially recognize and compensate for work-related mental illness. So now schizophrenia, for instance, can be considered work-induced and can be compensated accordingly. So this led other distressed workers, including teachers, doctors, public administrators, corporate executives, and their families, to begin to testify as moral witnesses, highlighting the emotional strain of excessive labor, while making depression the quintessential illness of the recession era. At the same time, as all this was happening, a new generation of antidepressant was introduced to the Japanese market, and depression suddenly became a nationwide phenomenon. Sales of antidepressants increased fivefold in just over 6 years. So in my book, Depression in Japan, I discussed how the Japanese situation contrasted with what was happening in the United States at the time, where depression was usually talked about as a problem of an individual's neurobiology, for which Prozac was not frequently offered as a solution, although at the same time, Prozac was being criticized by some critics in the US as, like I said, as being part of the pharma apparatus of neoliberal capitalism aimed at keeping workers productive without upsetting the status quo. In Japan, the highly politicized increase in the visibility of depression provided conditions for understanding depression as an illness rooted in both biology and society, with responsibility, therefore, lying beyond the individual worker. The fact that people kept killing themselves from overwork depression suggested that little had changed in work environments over the last 2 decades between these tragic suicides at Dentsu. However, much has changed, in fact. In the early 2000s, when I used to talk about overwork depression and overwork suicide in North America and Europe, people would listen incredulously, expressing surprise at what seemed to be a rather exotic phenomena limited to Japan. In the decade that followed, however, depression in the workplace became so ubiquitous in industrialized societies that it emerged as the new social pathology of the 21st century. Just as suicide in the 19th century, at the time of Durkheim, became a political problem, triggering novel ways of understanding social maladies. Depression today provides a map of collective feelings, a way to measure happiness and unhappiness. This is certainly true in France, where the nation has debated the meaning of a spate of suicides in the workplace, including that of a worker at France Telecom who set himself on fire in his office parking lot at a time when the company was privatizing. So when my book was published in French and they had a press conference, and I was fortunate enough to talk to some of the family members whose husband committed overwork suicide in protest to their work environment. And it was just really heartbreaking. Germany has had to grapple with the suicidal act of a co-pilot who crashed his plane in 2015 that killed 150 people, prompting a search for ways to intervene in the lives of burnt-out workers without seriously violating their privacy. Italy has for some time experimented with using experts' help for workers having depression from bullying. In China as well, depression in the workplace seems to be an increasing problem, and the Japanese stress evaluation tables has been translated into Chinese and has been used in Taiwan for years. So across nations, the formerly private business of mental illness has become a way for workers to demonstrate tangible damage from work stress and claim recognition and compensation for psychological suffering. But at the same time, making workplace pathology visible has also had the effect of heightening public awareness about the risk ill individuals can, though very infrequently, pose to society, such as the co-pilot, the German co-pilot. So this has resulted in some calling for closer scrutiny of people's private lives in the name of prevention and early intervention in mental illness. Particularly as depression is increasingly discussed as an illness of productivity and a serious burden on national economies, various governments as well as corporations are competing to develop novel neuropsychological technologies to detect and prevent mental illness, including mass screening of populations, digital monitoring of employees, as well as drug treatments, which combined began to present a fairly dystopic image of the future workplace, all of which begins to resemble the story that I discussed at the very beginning. So by studying novel forms of surveillance around depression in the workplace and the consequent debates over the new corporate care of the self in Japan, I hope to find out what happens to people's minds and subjectivities when their bodies and minds become constantly monitored and the information is made available to corporations and or the government. Will that lead to sinister forms of social control or to something more protective and even health-inducing, even one genuinely caring form of surveillance? Will it leave people feeling both cared for, but not over-policed? So that's the question that I like to discuss for the rest of the talk. A person's health often involves personal secrets, yet the boundaries of what people consider secret can differ considerably between nations, depending in part upon ideas about collective responsibility and individual liberty. Unlike in the United States, where government interventions in personal health can trigger resistance from those who claim to cherish individual liberty over state intervention. In Japan, state surveillance of workers' health has been widely accepted as a means of civil protection for a long time, and is often and is even sometimes discussed as a result of workers' historical struggle to obtain a system of public health. The Japanese state has long mandated large-scale corporations to hire occupational doctors and provide annual physical checkups in order to monitor and maintain workers' physical health. Many corporations operating under the lifetime employment system have devised various health programs, including extensive sick leave. So people who suffer from depression often take sick leaves for a year, 3 years, sometimes even longer. Daily exercise periods, weekend sporting events, and training programs as opportunities for strengthening management worker solidarity. This kind of corporate care has been generally welcomed by workers as forms of health protection and also self-improvement, even celebrated as a holistic Japanese-style welfare system. Yet, one realm the Japanese corporations have long hesitated to enter into was that of workers' mental health. which after the late 1990s had been a no-go zone. This was partly because mental illness was strongly stigmatized, and also because the psychological realm was understood to be deeply private. Japanese occupational doctors have thus strictly adhered to a conceptual distinction between diseases and cases. So rather than actively proving for workers' hidden psychiatric diseases, as a rule, they do not intervene unless workers have trouble functioning at work and surface as cases. So there were quite a few cases that doctors report where workers obviously had schizophrenia, but because they're functioning fine, they wouldn't be reported as cases. So given that workers' psychological health has long marked the border of what can be imagined to be benevolent surveillance of intimate private life, the introduction of stress checks signals a clear departure. And this was created by the government in order to screen the workers for depression in order to prevent suicide. Because when Dentsu was held liable, the Japan's Supreme Court decided that the companies actually have the obligations to foresee the risk of suicide. I'll talk about this later too, but even in cases where workers themselves were not aware that they had depression. So what led to this radical change has to do with three factors: the changing conversations about depression in popular media, a changing understanding of stress in the workplace, and public awareness that psychiatric treatments are not a surefire remedy for mental illness. Let me see. Oh, yeah. First of all, as depression began to spread to different segments of society, popular discourse about depression began to lose its moralizing overtones, setting in motion a kind of looping effect. During the 1990s, when depression was still assumed to be rare among Japanese, I would hear from depressed patients that they had never imagined that their low energy and dejected mood was symptoms of a psychiatric illness. In the 2000s, when people were exposed to a massive campaign about depression conducted by the government, psychiatrists, and pharmaceutical companies, an increasing number began to think that they might be psychologically ill and voluntarily sought medical care to receive antidepressants. By the late 2000s, however, it was becoming apparent that antidepressants were not necessarily curing people. It might even be generating a new type of patient with a protracted and chronic form of depression who had difficulty recovering and returning to work. As such individuals emerged and became a social problem, some of them, particularly young workers on sick leave for a very long time, were also subject to moral blame in media stories, asserting that they were not suffering true depression, which is from work stress, but rather new type depression, the cause of which lay not in stress, but in patients' immature personalities. These media accusations and new labels for people's distress failed to take into account, among other things, structural changes in the recession era workplace in which young employees were no longer mentored by senior workers as they had been under the traditional apprentice system. In any case, these debates raised new concerns about how to think about depressed people and how to treat them, beyond simply prescribing antidepressants. Secondly, a parallel shift in perspective was happening in health practices in the workplace. With the introduction of stress evaluation tables in 1999, which is used to objectively measure the severity of stress in the workers' lives, and to determine their eligibility for workers' compensation. And the stress evaluation tables is actually interesting. It lists 32 items for work and also for private lives. So there are items such as like complaint from a client, scolded by a boss, and each failure in a project, So each item, each stressful event is given a predetermined score. And for private lives, for instance, like a divorce would be given score 3 or something, death in the family, score 3, entrance exam of a child would be like score 1, relocation, like moving to a new place would be like 1 or something. So like a doctor can look at the medical charts and calculate how much stress the worker was exposed to at work and also at home, and sum up the numbers and decide which stress either at work or home was a greater contributing factor for one's depression. And this score combined with the actual time of overwork, overtime, are used to determine whether the worker is eligible for compensation, and so on. So I lost my place. Okay, so this is, so used to objectively measure the severity of stress in workers' lives and to determine their eligibility for workers' compensation. Depression officially became an illness produced by work and a frequently cited reason for long-term sick leave. Now that both the government and corporations can be held liable for failing to foresee the risk of an employee's suicide, notably even in cases where employees themselves were not aware of their own mental illness, corporate authorities have begun to investigate and intervene in workers' psychological health beyond what used to be considered appropriate or necessary. Under the government's guidance, corporations have devised systems of stress checks, calculating workers' overtime, categorizing them accordingly to presumed levels of stress, and encouraging the highly stressed to seek medical consultations. However, as corporate health personnel realized that there is no simple and straightforward causal relationship between stress and depression, they also came to be critical of those who get depressed and have a hard time recovering from depression. People like this might be referred to as stress spreaders, kind of like, as in the coronavirus, whose illnesses impose extra labor on others, increasing overall stress levels of the workplace, potentially resulting in yet more depression among colleagues. As the depressed were thus differentiated from stress-immune high achievers, as those who presented a risk for the company, both the government and corporations began to explore different methods for going beyond merely measuring stress and pursuing more effective methods for scrutinizing workers in our lives. So thirdly, the growing public frustration over the ineffectiveness of antidepressants has led psychiatrists to experiment with a new therapeutic regime called rework. Specific rework, which is specifically designed to rehabilitate and return depressed workers to their original workplace. Rework features various programs, which include activities like ping pong, painting, calligraphy, yoga, and social skills training, meditation, combined with PowerPoint presentations, and is a crossover between medical treatment and occupational training, with a strong orientation toward cognitive behavioral therapy. So for instance, to facilitate insight into workers' negative affect or distorted cognition manifested as poor moods and difficulty thinking, rework doctors place them together with other patients in a mock office environment that serves as an experimental lab, which often becomes a sort of emotional theater at times, where they reenact scenes of their poor interpersonal actions that led them to become depressed in the first place. They are then asked to analyze and discuss these scenes in order to promote understanding of how they may appear in the eyes of others, so that they can better protect themselves from depression and also ensure neutral and or positive social engagements. Rework doctors point out that patients are often either too tormented by a strong sense of guilt or too angered and victimized to grasp that they themselves may be regarded as perpetrators of stress. Thus, without therapy, they are unprepared when they return to work to deal with how the feelings of others and resentment in particular can disturb them and upset the work environment. While rework is welcomed by many as much needed psychological intervention and has yielded success in equipping workers with corporate survival skills, patient dropout and relapses are ongoing problems. The complicated business of reintegration is also sometimes criticized as a means of reclassifying apparently dysfunctional workers for the short-time benefit of restoring productivity, while shifting attention away from societal factors that contributed to psychological breakdowns and workers' vulnerability in the first place. This is a serious charge, particularly given government-commissioned research suggesting that all some workers need to avoid depression may be a few more hours of sleep each day. A national desire to control psychological health has provided a good opportunity for preventive psychiatry, aimed at keeping people from becoming mentally ill. Hence the introduction of stress checks in the workplace, with attention paid to workers' experiences of work stress, supplementing the previous policy of objectively quantifying stress. Stress checks are declared a means of self-care, raising concerns about potentially excessive responsibility for workers. What the government is hoping to create seems to be an ideal community of people who monitor themselves, their own mental health, perhaps something akin to the participants of these quantified self movements located in around Silicon Valley in California. In this community, as you know, members celebrate constant self-health monitoring as a way of gaining a new kind of scientific self-understanding and reflexivity. But for Japanese workers who are expected to participate for the good of the company they work for, they're caught between their individual freedom to conceal their private lives and societal demands to reveal everything about themselves. My research suggests that while there's apprehension on the part of workers about being monitored and exposed to the public, there is for some also the opposite desire to escape from freedom, so to speak, or rather to escape from the responsibility of self-surveillance by allowing the government or your employer to do it for you. This desire is understandable, given that individuals are increasingly responsible for self-care at a time when, in reality, they lack the power to achieve this. So one person I interviewed, a highly overworked but seemingly healthy worker of a leading electronics company, discussed her experience of routine mental health checks at her company and told me she always marked feeling suicidal in her stress check without actually feeling that way at all. She did this, she said, to indicate her vulnerability and therefore secure a consultation. She believes that this would provide her a form of protection, serving as a proof of her stress in case she actually does become depressed. Yet, as experts of occupational medicine indicated to me, this interviewee's attempt to create a protective data double of herself might easily work against her, as her revelation of suicidal feelings also raised a red flag to management, marking her as a potential candidate for future layoffs. Furthermore, while her attempt to control the data about her is a response to the tightening web of corporate surveillance, this double of the self the work presents
if discovered to be inaccurate, would likely evoke confusion and mistrust among health professionals, many of whom continue to regard themselves as caregivers rather than surveillance officers. In the emerging surveillance systems, individuals are pressed to choose whether to give up or even manufacture secrets without knowing whether doing so will work for or against them. The process of creating a means of collective psychological management by the government may eventually lead to a holistic perspective, with psychological health of the general population at stake. Social concerns and environmental concerns can be seen as important as the mental health of any one individual. If so, then this could help generate new ways of diagnosing and intervening in the health of the general population, rather than relying on workers' self-care to solve problems related to social structures and the environment. Indeed, corporations assemble individual data about employees into big data in order to assess the stress levels of not just individual workers, but entire departments and divisions. This type of data management raises questions about how such analysis might increase pressure on middle management, who are held responsible for not only boosting productivity, but also their own psychological health. Also rather worrisome is that corporate psychological surveillance in Japan looks more and more like strategies used but now by the US military, where stress tests and resilience training have become instruments for encouraging soldiers to adopt positive mental health attitudes as a way of increasing psychological fitness, something that could serve to mask the absurd predicament of war and the geopolitical implications of economic neoliberalism. As the concept of resilience is adopted and applied to non-military contexts across the globe, it renders what was once assumed to be the natural ability of people in adverse situations to recover from traumatic experiences on their own into a process to undergo only with the help of experts. As anthropologist Alan Young warns, artificially achieved resilience may soon come to displace effortless normality as the default condition of human life. And these are real concerns now that companies like Facebook are creating the database of despair, as they call it, and using it to sort of prevent depression and suicide, especially of people under 24, who actually make up 75% of people who have mental disorders. And that such data, big data, is now being used in many places as a technology of suicide prevention. And I mean, this can really work because WHO now reports that one suicide happens in every 40 seconds. So this is a serious global social mental health issues. So this kind of technology can really work for people, but can also work against people when it's put into use as a form of insidious surveillance. And the same thing with text therapy and chatbot. There's an interesting article by Alice Gregory in New Yorker in 2015 called "Are You There?" And it describes different forms of text therapy that can really do wonders for young people especially, but at the same time creates a rather sort of kind of scary exposition and exploration of the private lives. So this is something that perhaps we can talk about later. So seeing in this context, the Japanese government, and this is the last slide, I think. So seeing this context, the Japanese government's calls for nationwide stress checks for workers could be read as an ominous sign of a coming global age of preventive mental health, with sights set on far more than merely caring for the mentally ill. For the time being, the state and the corporate world still require workers as responsible for their own emotional self-knowledge to report feeling unwell. The old methods of self-disclosure and self-discipline still remain the basic ways to care for oneself. But what will happen in the coming age of preemptive medicine and its technologies of mass screening via neuroimaging and genetic testing, when everyone becomes identifiable, as this is borrowing from Nick Rose, pre-symptomatically ill? Preemptive medicine has been criticized as premature for psychiatry, which, after all, lacks such essential tools for early detection in solid disease categories, and where the technology does not as yet exist to make strong predictions about a person's future health as it does for other forms of illnesses. Yet, in Japan, where it is estimated that the total number of mentally ill patients, including those with dementia, is double that of cancer patients, the government's desire for efficient management of these problems runs high. As state and health professionals desperately search for more objective biological means of diagnosing and screening for depression in place of the stress evaluation tables, it might not be long before these are replaced by thorough biological stress management using stress tracing technologies. Such surveillance would likely shift attention away from workers' social experiences and emotions to objective signs of stress, such as neurobiological abnormalities detected at the level of cells, even though some leading neuropsychiatrists that I talked to have expressed skepticism that such technology engenders unrealistic expectations and potential for abuse. If this kind of exploration of psychological secrets becomes possible and is combined with a culture of risk aversion, as well as commercial interest, will it affect the way in which we understand depression and workers' subjectivity? There is hope for positive scenarios to emerge from all this, in that there are serious attempts underway to use surveillance of workers as a way to do surveillance of the workplace itself. One cannot help but hope that out of such efforts to extract workers' health secrets will come a way to strike a balance between the demands of a workplace, which requires resilient employees, and a more caring system of health protection that will recognize, even cherish, fundamental human vulnerability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. This was a fascinating lecture, and okay, we have already several hands. Yeah, so I'm happily passing voice to you. It would be great if you could show your face. If you don't want, it's perfectly fine, but please unmute yourself and speak up. I don't know who was first, I'm sorry. So maybe let's start with Diana, and then I think there was Jakub, Quentin, who else? Zara, yeah? Who else wanted to ask something?
I think they were just applauding.
It was just, yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so please, Diana.
I said I wasn't first, but I can go first. Junko, you talk a lot about the surveillance of workers with depression. Depression remains a fuzzy concept. I'm not sure if you accept it or don't accept it, but that's an aside. I'm just thinking of the situation in the UK, although I now live in France, where people who are out of work, partly sometimes because of mental distress, are subject to this kind of surveillance. So they have to fill in questionnaires And the purpose of these questionnaires is to see if you're eligible for certain kinds of welfare benefits. In order to be eligible, you have to make yourself look as awful as possible. You have to emphasize your lacks. You have to emphasize the things that you can't do. You have to do all of this. And at the same time, the state is doing things like going to gyms and asking for lists of their disabled customers. The implication being that if you can go to the gym, you can go to work. And then there is this regime called something, conditionality. So in one of the groups that you may be placed, if you can't work because of mental health problems, you have to have CBT. You have to have CBT because mental health not working has become a mental health problem, and going to work has become a good mental health outcome. And those sanctions can be drastic. They can be taking away your money for weeks at a time if you don't turn up for a course of CBT to make you work ready. Now, there's something else that strikes me about this, which is we now know that everybody's talking about mental health. Everybody's talking about mental health. In my view, it's a proxy for talking about emotions, but like, it doesn't matter, and I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah, everybody's talking about mental health, but this group of people who have to turn up at the job centre to be made work ready and be surveyed and cleared all the time, and now the other. So we don't talk about mental health, it's quite all right. But the people who are really down on the uppers, the people who are really suffering have become the other. We don't talk about people who hear voices. We don't talk about people who get energized to the point of explosion. We don't talk about people who believe King Charles III is their brother, for example. So we don't talk about that. So they're excluded, and they're subject to this, the kind of surveillance you were talking about, but in a different configuration and to a different degree. I'll start. I just wonder what you thought.
Thank you, Diana.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Yeah, that's a real dilemma, isn't it? Because when I started out, I had such hopes for depression. I was actually quite excited about the fact that depression wasn't talked about as an individual problem. It wasn't talked about as just a matter of the brain. You know, it was actually recognized as a product of stress and social injustice. And that, you know, workers were using this category to not talk about their individual weakness, but rather, you know, the suffering that they were all collectively going through. So this was like a real workers' movement. This was really like a way of transforming society. Like psychiatry was actually being a motor for social change. And I had so much hope for it. But after 20 years, more to be more precise, more like 22 years, I see a sort of a dead end because there are more and more workers who are depressed and more workers who are not getting better. And even though they are on sick leave and they are given compensation, this is not a happy way to live. And the companies have created many changes actually because of Dentsu incidents. They, like Dentsu, for instance, stopped using the lights after 10 p.m. So whereas before people were working until midnight or overnight, suddenly like they were shutting off all the lights at 10. And it was a spectacular sight. But then I began to hear from my students, former students, that, those who got into like the highly competitive companies, that the company's atmosphere apparently had changed, because it's not like the amount of workload has changed, but the work hours has become much shortened, which meant that the workplace in Japanese companies, where my students are now, former students are now working at. So which meant that people didn't have any time for others anymore. Like senior staff didn't have time to train and to be nice towards young workers anymore. So this has become like a sort of a very sort of uncongenial workplace. So yeah, so I realized, I really debate about this, whether or not psychiatry actually can be a motor for social change, or if, because of its inherent individualistic paradigm, it doesn't really create a remedy for social ills, even though it does recognize it. So that's one of the questions that I love to ask you all. But that's also the reason why I shifted from depression to dementia, because there's now a huge user movement around dementia. And dementia is a little different in the sense that people who become, who come with this affliction have had so-called healthy, normal life. So they have a sense of entitlement that was lacking from psychiatric users in Japan before. So they demand things. And they're suddenly like finding themselves as being relegated to the psychiatric category of demented patients. And they're not buying it. They're speaking up. They're demanding that the policies be changed. They're demanding that the society change so that they don't have to feel ashamed of themselves, so that they can live a normal life, even with their disabilities. So I'm hoping, yeah. So I'm hoping that there's sort of blurring of categories of psychiatric diseases, that there's sort of a user movement beyond psychiatric classifications to unite on the basis of neurobiological difficulties that the people experience. So instead of using regarding biology as something stigmatizing and problematic, I'm hoping, or at least I'm beginning to see how people use neurobiological discourse as a way of claiming commonalities, as a way of creating solidarities beyond psychiatric categories. But I'm really curious about what you people think about this, and if you see the similar things happening in other places of the world.
Okay, thank you for this answer. And maybe somebody wants to respond to Professor Kitanaka's question. That would be really great. Please don't be shy, just speak up. We have, yes, please, Baptiste.
Hi, Beata. Thank you very much for your talk. Regarding, so I work in the UK, but I come from France, and I think that there is something a bit complicated about the recognition of social suffering at work. And you took the case of France Telecom, where there were a wave of suicide. Well, from what I remember, the company, I think, tried to argue that since these people had mental health issues, then their suicide was related to their individual and personal weaknesses. And therefore, this argument was used against them, against the compensation of these suicides or the recognition of these suicides as work-related. So I'm not sure your model works very well in this case. But I'm not a specialist of this question, so maybe I'm wrong. I wanted to ask you more generally, what do you think is the role of social scientists like medical anthropologists, sociologists of mental health? Because it seems to me that in your approach, you're trying to see some hopes in the psychiatric approach to social distress as something that can change. But more and more, I wonder whether we should be also sorts of political economists, because we can, like claim that workers should be better helped, I don't know, that they should have the time to talk with senior workers so that they have more advice, etc., to be nice with one another. But at the same time, it's very difficult to talk about this without seeing the more structural aspect of it, like why companies have to be more and more competitive. Because what you're describing is kind of a textbook case of neoliberalism. And so I don't know what you see, how you see the position of social scientists in this, especially social scientists specializing in mental health in this configuration.
That's a tough one. Especially, first of all, with the case about the France Telecom and also Germany, like when I was following it up, it was too ambiguous, but I know after that, like I think Europe ended up not having the kind of the same system for recognizing depression. And that I think the argument that was used at the time was, the question of privacy, like companies shouldn't be involved in workers' mental health. And so, I mean, they've taken a different route, I think. And I just read a wonderful dissertation about what's happening in Chile and how people are using a psychiatric category to claim the same sort of social suffering argument. So I think this has taken different form. So depression is imbued with such different meanings across the globe that it's really striking how localized it has become, even though at the same time it's really being universalized. As with regard to the second question, what is the role of the social scientists? I mean, I completely agree that we need different kinds of social scientists, including political economists, for analyzing the workplace pathologies in social pathologies. But at the same time, I mean, over the last 20-something years that I've been in Japan for, I've been invited more than anybody else by psychiatrists to give a talk at medical schools, medical societies, and also Japan's science councils and so on, because they're desperate to understand the predicaments that they themselves find themselves in. They don't really have that sort of macro perspective to understand why they're suddenly having to prescribe so many antidepressants, why they're having to prescribe antidepressants, even though they fully realize that, this is not about individual depression, it's really about money, it's about economy. So they're really desperate to sort of situate their own experience in a larger framework. Not that it solves everything, of course, or quickly, but I think it creates a new layer of reflexivity in them, the kind of perspective that they don't really learn in medical school. And now that I teach in medical schools, and I find it always surprising to see how surprised the medical students and young doctors become when they're exposed to this kind of perspective. So I don't know, like I just started teaching at medical school in the last few years, and I haven't really seen the actual effect. Like the students that I've taught haven't actually become doctors yet, even though I've taught many doctors. But the doctors that I teach are the ones who are already socially aware. So to what extent this perspective can have an impact on medical education or society at large, I don't know. I often feel like, even though I'm often invited, I feel like I'm sort of being an entertainer, doing the kind of things that the psychiatrists themselves were doing back in the 1960s and 70s at the time of anti-psychiatry movement. And somehow they have lost that space of critical engagement. And now they need an outsider like myself to bring it back, to have a sort of moment of reflexivity. But I don't know, maybe that just becomes a temporary space to make them feel a little better because they are now more reflexive. And now they can go back to, back to business as usual. I don't know. I mean, I love to hear from you guys about, what you do and how you see how you can impact medicine and as well as society.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Actually, okay, I will maybe give voice to other people, and then I will use the chance to speak if we still have time. So please come up with questions, comments. Maybe you have some interesting insights about how this whole psychiatric discourse, medicalization, depression, mental health crisis, this sort of issues, like how is it in your country where you live? So anything, even if you are not a scholar, even if you are not, yeah, please, anybody. No, really? Okay, Mira, yes, please.
Okay, that might be, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so that might be a bit anecdotal because I'm not a scholar. I work individually. But from my experience with working with individuals and companies from big ones to small ones as a psychologist, I have this impression that some companies, especially, maybe I will not try to create an impression that there is some pattern. But yeah, some companies, I feel like they want to introduce caring for mental health of their workers into the environment they're creating, or maybe provide free mental health service. So they pay for the service for the workers, but yeah, it's anonymous, so they try to keep it like private. And the other side that I observe in my practice is this kind of apparent or seeming care for workers. So like organizing events, but that's not really, in my opinion, caring for their mental health. Because if you organize an event once a year, like last week we had this, or 2 weeks ago we had this week of awareness about mental health. And for example, some companies organize events. Like for me, that's bullshit. If you are, you know what I mean? Like, so in this sense, I think it's about money a lot. So instead of paying for a real like service that you might provide, and I'm sure those companies have enough money to provide that to their workers, they organize those events who like seemingly raise awareness about mental health, etc. But that's not really creating any change for their workers, because that's like 1 or 2 meetings with a mental health professional. Then that's not enough. Even if you're not depressed, even if you are burned out, or it's something minor, that's not enough to do anything, basically, in my opinion. Does that gives you some picture of how?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm really curious about how the rise of depression has created different conditions in different places. So that's, what's the country that you work in?
Poland.
Poland.
Yeah,
I see.
Poland.
I see. I was curious. I was curious whether the sort of background of, the different social systems and political philosophies might create a different kinds of awareness about the nature of depression or not. Do you think that kind of historical awareness might contribute to like a more politicized ideas about depression and mental illness, or that's not really the case?
Can you maybe ask the question in other words, so also non-scholars can understand.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Right.
You're
Sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, well, the notion of depression as it's developed in the US is, I think, based on capitalist principles, right? Of individual responsibility, individual autonomy, and so on. I think for instance, like socialist country might have a different vision, a different human model. I don't know. I'm just curious if sort of history of different political philosophies might give rise to different understanding of depression or not.
Okay, so I could indeed say a few words to this question, but maybe I'm sorry, Mira. I saw your hand, and then Grażyna started talking, and I thought Grażyna is Mira, and I just noticed that you are Mira. So please, you can ask the question now if you still want to. We still have some, I know, 7 minutes or 8. So please.
Yes, I'm sorry. I did not have actually a question. It was more that I wanted to answer about the perspective in my country. I'm from Germany, but I'm really sorry. I think I missed your presentation because I got confused with the time. But I'm now here for questions and answers. And yes, I think I don't have a big overview here. I'm interested in psychosis, people having psychosis or some experience with psychosis. And I think here's also really dominant the biogenetical picture of mental illness, like it's something in the brain. But there are also, or from my perspective, I would say there's also some hope there for another more subjective approach to understand mental illness, or to get in touch with people who got those experiences. And I think this is more the exception, but there are, for example, the I don't know if it is how it is called in English. It's a trialogue. It's a kind of speaking where professionals, people with experience, and members of families are meeting, and we have this kind of like not dialogue but trialogue. I don't know how to pronounce it right. And we have this in a couple of cities in Germany, and this is like a forum, and like professionals get more reflexive and more aware about the other perspective, and they care. But it is also like you said,
open dialogue. Is it like open dialogue?
Oh yes, I think it's
Okay.
right.
Yeah,
it's like this kind.
Popular here as well. Yeah.
Yes, and I think there are also some small hospital stations where there are also psychiatrists who are more aware of approaching the mental health issue differently, but it's still an exception, I think. The biological model is dominant, and I think this is also coming also influenced by the US, like the mental health. I forgot the big name of the mental health organization there. They are trying to adapt a new model of not symptom-based, but biogenetic model of measuring. I'm sorry, I'm out of words now. Yeah, but this is my perspective from Germany.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, so sorry, just a second. Guys, we still have like 4 minutes. Is it fine? Do you can you stay? Yeah, okay. So I can say just like maybe very shortly about the Polish context. So of course, we had socialism, and then in the 89 it finished in the early 90s, and then it's I find the interesting similarity when you started talking about this new type of depression, which signified this like immature attitude towards life. So there is a really very interesting book by a Polish scholar Grzegorz Sokół. It's called Working Through What Is: Depression in Depression and New Reality in sorry, I don't remember the subtitle, but it has the second part of the title. I can find it later and put it on in the chat box. But he basically describes how this, like westernized, medicalized idiom of depression, of course, based on the American models and DSM and so on, entered when the Polish market transformation happened, and how in the beginning of the 90s, depression as a diagnosis started to describe both like the losers of transformation, so those people who were not able to adapt to this new reality, which was, because he also gives a whole historical political explanation of like how the newly introduced capitalism started to be described as this, more real than social realism, than socialism. So this new reality was like posing demands, and losers, so people who were not able to adapt to these demands, were viewed as having depression. And then also the winners, so the people who somehow believed in these promises of new reality too much. Somehow they they worked hard, and they got into debt and so on, and then they also ended up depressed. So this is very interesting, because this moralizing tone of depression meaning immaturity, that this is still a problem with your attitude towards the world, that you cannot kind of manage, the you have a perceptual some kind of perceptual disorder, let's say. So this is very interesting. But okay, so this was early 90s. And now I think from drawing from my research on the psychiatric discourse in Poland, and also interviews with young adults with depression, I think that we have pretty much biological definition of depression, which is hegemonic. And of course, in the context of COVID, this stress induced depression started to be, I mean, of course, everybody knows that this comes from stress, but I think what psychiatry managed to do is somehow circumvent this, the causes of the stress, and just put the label on this stress that still this is a disease, and this is your individual problem, and you have to get treatment and so on. So yeah, okay, sorry, I talked very long.
No, that's really fascinating, because I think depression has become such a localized idiom of distress, but at the same time, the neurobiological paradigm is shifting, it's collapsing, right? Because the serotonin hypothesis has been refuted, and it's debunked in the global psychiatric discourse now. And WHO dropped antidepressants as its first recommendation for depression in 2019, I think. And so global mental health movement has shifted its focus somewhat from antidepressants and neurobiological interventions to more psychological, more social approaches. So the world is now suddenly realizing that the whole neurobiological paradigm hasn't really brought the fruit that it promised it would. And I hear more and more, especially from younger people, that their understanding of depression and other forms of mental illness is much more politicized. They talk about the economy, neoliberalism. I don't think they are buying the neurobiological model anymore. I mean, it could be partly neurobiological. I mean, I don't deny that my brain has to do something with it, but that doesn't mean that that's the whole story. And that I think people are becoming more in tune with the complexity of the psychiatric disorders. So if that kind of awareness is becoming a more global phenomena, I don't know, but I keep hearing that from different regions. It's almost like it's still remaining a fragmented fact without a discourse. So there's no like one place where these can be assembled to create a global discourse that can stand against the neurobiological paradigm. But I think the awareness is definitely happening everywhere. So that's really fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is time to end our meeting because we used our 1 hour and a half. And yeah, Professor Kitanaka, thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
And yeah, hope to see you soon. And
yes.
And thank you guys that you all came and stayed for such a long time. And you are invited, of course, for the next seminar happening on, I think, 25th November.
22nd.
Oh, sorry. Okay, 22nd November. Professor Stefan X will be.
Okay, Stefan.
Yes.
He's a very good friend. So
yeah. So yeah, and I saw Kasia put the name of the book in the chat box, so you can check it out. And yes, thank you very much. This is the
thank you. Thanks.